Bibles, you might turn to the book of Daniel and at least place a marker there. We may do some getting the setting of this, so there may be some other places we reference as we get into the book, but we want to jump into our study of the book of Daniel tonight. Our goal is to cover chapter 1. Super good to see you. When you take a quarter off and go teach the teen class and come back out here, I've got to get my bearings about me. And I've never taught with Mr. Colby, so it always takes me a couple of weeks to get adjusted to whoever I'm teaching with. But it's going to be great. Looking forward to it. I really do love this Bible period. One, for my sake, the narrative kind of simplifies in some ways. We go from having both Kings and Chronicles and having to layer those on top of each other, where really we're just kind of focused on one storyline for the most part. That doesn't mean they don't overlap. They do overlap, but we get a little bit of a clearer, direct focus here than what we did have. But what we want to do is we're picking up in the period that we call captivity. The 70 years of captivity is where we'll start. And by the end of this quarter, Lord willing, we'll be at the end of the Old Testament. We'll be in the period that we call the years of silence, where there is no revelation coming from God. And so we will kind of make our way through really about 200 years of history over the course of this time. And so this, for the most part, the period we're going to talk about is captivity and then return and rebuilding when you think about our 17 periods of Bible history.
Yeah, and kind of getting right into it, and Larson doesn't share his charts with me, so I don't know. Those are private, so I see those when you see them. But anyway, we're going to. There are three major prophets that prophesied during this time that we call the captivity. Do y'all know who they are? Who's the first one? Obviously, back in Jerusalem. Oh, was there a cheat sheet up there?
Yeah, so I turned it off. I did.
I heard somebody say it. Jeremiah. And what type of people is he prophesying to back in Jerusalem?
The ones that were left, like
Yeah, which are what type of people that would have been left there? Yeah, the poor people that would have been left back in Jerusalem. So that's what, and I think it's helpful to know this kind of up front. That's what Jeremiah's doing. Who's the second one? The book we're in. Daniel. And where is he going to be? Babylon, and he is going to be working mainly with the king. And then after Jeremiah and Daniel, you also had Ezekiel. And he's also going to be in Babylon. He's going to come a little later than Daniel. He's going to come during the second captivity in 597, but he will be working mainly with the common people there in Babylon. So I just kind of think that's kind of helpful to wrap our minds around up front before we even dive into it.
It is very helpful. So when we pick up with our timeline, y'all have covered all the way through the end of 2 Kings, right? So all of this should be familiar. You've got the first captives are going to be taken in 606, 605. You'll see different dates on that. Most of the time, the question is trying to calculate based on Babylonian time and biblical time exactly when that happened. But about 606, the first captives are taken. That's what I think when the Bible talks about 70 years of captivity, that's the date we're starting with. We also could consider the destruction of the temple to be kind of the, like Mr. Colby mentioned, that's kind of the big moment of, yes, it's really over. Because you can see, even after the first captives are taken, you still have Jehoiakim on the throne for a little while. You've got Jehoiakim, his descendant will be on the throne just for a very short time. And then Zedekiah is going to be put on the throne. And you may have already talked about all of this, I know. Jehoiakim will be mentioned here in chapter 1. So that's kind of where we'll focus our attention. But Daniel will be right here within that period. And then, as Mr. Colby said, you can see that overlap with Ezekiel here a little later. But the way we're going to approach it for the most part is we'll talk about all of Daniel. And when we talk about all of Daniel, that carries us basically all the way to 536 BC. We'll talk about why that date is more significant. I'll add to the timeline as we go. But we start with Daniel. Basically, he's in that first wave of captives, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. When we think about the book of Daniel, as we already made mention, mostly Daniel is interacting with the kings. So in chapters 1 through 4, the primary Babylonian king he's interacting with is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who comes in 606 and takes the first captives. He is the one ultimately who is responsible for the destruction of the temple, and he lives all the way till I think it's 562 BC. So that's basically the first 4 chapters are dealing with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. Then Nebuchadnezzar has a couple of short-lived successors, but in chapter 5, we're going to deal with a guy named Belteshazzar. He will be the Babylonian king that is ultimately ruined, that he's destroyed by a guy named Cyrus. So from really chapter 6, end of chapter 5 and chapter 6, is Daniel's interaction with Cyrus and Darius during that period of time in Persia. And in 7 through 12, which is at the end of Daniel's life, really focuses on kingdoms that are not even coming yet. He focuses on human history as it will develop and how God is working and all of that. So that kind of gives you an outline. Babylon, Persia, and then looking into the future for the development of those kingdoms. And perhaps you know some of these stories. Maybe you don't, but all of these help us. Really, we could study a lot of the book of Daniel during that years of silence period, because he covers so much history. When we don't get any other revelation, we could look at the book of Daniel and have a really good history of what happens during that period. I have heard that if somebody wanted to prove that the God that they served was the true God, they would carry around a copy of the book of Daniel and a modern history lesson from their time, before the time of Jesus. And they would say, look at what Daniel wrote and look at what's happening, and it's all lining up. And so that's a really powerful, especially like Daniel 10, 11, 12, where he's looking forward to what would happen to the people of God. And they're like, if you read the book of Maccabees and line it up with the book of Daniel, it's amazing how many things line up. So all that is to say is whatever Mr. Colby's going to say.
And another thing about the book itself, too, is I think we can easily divide it kind of in half. Mm-hmm. The first half of the book is going to be kind of the stories we teach our children, the easier to understand narrative type stories like The Lion's Den and stories like that. And then the second half of the book, the second 6 chapters are going to be the more difficult visions and dreams and that type of work. But this first part, that doesn't mean that it's not important. These stories that we're going to talk about, they go to show that God is in control.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. I think that's super helpful. I think that's the lesson we need to learn from the book of Daniel. Yes. Is like, as we closed out the last quarter, the wheels have come off, right? Like that's what it looks like. And yet God is still in control. And maybe we emphasize this as we went through Kings and Chronicles. God's word is sure. Right? And there's been a lot of promises that God's made that it looks very questionable how all that can happen now. God's word is sure. And so we're actually going to see some of the beginning ideas of the return of the kingdom and the growth of the kingdom. That second half, so we got the first half that's like narrative accounts that we know, and that second half is called apocalyptic. And the word apocalyptic, a lot of times it's associated with end times, but Daniel's not only talking about end times in that section. The word apocalypse is actually the word revelation. It's the unveiling. It's the pulling back the curtain. What Daniel does in chapters 7 through 12, God does through Daniel, is kind of pulls back the curtain on world history. And I love this about the Bible is I love history, and there are good historical explanations for why Israel and Judah fell. And there's good explanations for why Assyria fell, and why Babylon rose, and why Babylon fell, and why Persia rose, and Persia fell. There are good history explanations for all those things. But all those things just scratch the surface. When we read the book of Daniel, when we read like the book of Ezekiel, when we read other what we might think of as apocalyptic books, what they do is they pull back the curtain on that history. And they say, you thought it was all just earth level, right? You thought it was all under the sun. God was at work in all of that. And so it's really important for us to have at least a little bit of a hold on these books, because when we come to the book of Revelation, That's how John is writing the book of Revelation, is pulling back the curtain on empires. We have good historical explanations on why the Roman Empire fell. But John pulls back the curtain and says, it's deeper than you think. It goes higher than you think as well. And so that's what the book of Daniel does for us. One commentary that I read called the theme of the book of Daniel, God's Kingdom Rising. And I like that because it looks like God's kingdom's over, right? His people are in captivity, the Babylonians. God's the one who rules. And we'll see that as we go through the book. Anything else as far as prep in looking at these first few verses?
Maybe one thing, you were talking about the history of it. I've heard Lonnie say that he likes to use this book as well as far as studying with people and showing evidences too, because of exactly what you were talking about. It's just a clear picture of history and the way it unfolded, and we can go back and look at it and say, hey, that's exactly how it happened.
That's right. Yeah, it's so good at doing prophetic history that lots of people deny that the book of Daniel was written in the setting that it was written in. Lots of people say it must have been written way later, and that's how good it is. I think there's a lot of evidence, ample evidence, that suggests that the book of Daniel is written before all the events that it describes in prophetic ways. I've been doing some reading on that, and it's not worth, I don't think, getting into. I just want you to know, for example, the stuff that he will talk about, Greece, that he names by name in that second section, Daniel 7 through 12, would not be really an empire until the 300s, 200s BC, and the Septuagint was translated right as the Greek arrival is happening, and as after the Greek spread has happened, and Daniel was in that translation. So it had to have been written way before that, and so it's just amazing to think about how early on all of this happens. So it's great history, and yet it's history that's written hundreds of years before all of that takes place. So it's a powerful account of who God is and what He can do. All right. Anything else? Anybody else have anything that you think we should know for groundwork as we go into the narrative of the book of Daniel? So we'll start chapter 1 in about 606. We'll spend most of our time in that period, but it will mention in verse 21 that Daniel was there till the first year of King Cyrus. So really we get that's 539. I have 536 on the board, but 539 BC will be the first year of King Cyrus. So we're talking about Daniel living right at 70 years in captivity, which will tell us several things as we go. All right. You want to take, how far do you want to read? You can maybe verse 7 or so? Or what do you have marked?
I've got through 4.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Now, I want to stop right there after verse 2, if that's okay.
It's perfect.
And if one of the men would turn right quick, just hold your place right there and turn back to 2 Kings chapter 20. And read verse 16 and 17. 2 Kings 20, verse 16 and 17.
In my house there is nothing among my treasures that I have not shown thee. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord.
All right, so that's going way back in time, way back into Hezekiah's day. And this is prophesied, this very thing that's going to happen. I'm going to start back in verse 2 again. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Verse 3, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. First of all, as we open up the book, I think it's important that we know, that we remember, how did we get here? How did they get to this point? I'm sorry? Disobedience, pride.
The sins of Jeroboam.
Yes, all the wicked and evil sins that we've talked about, that, and they've been warned and did not heed the warning. Like I mentioned in the invitation Wednesday night, they didn't heed the warning. So God finally said, that's it. I'm done. And here we are. We're in captivity in Babylon, and as Nebuchadnezzar comes back through and he besieges the city, he does take some of the articles of the treasure house of God, and he takes them and puts them into the house of his God, and he also takes some young men back there with him. And what are some of the qualities that it says those men have? All right. Okay. With no blemish. They were the elite, I guess you would say. They were the best of the best. And you know, when you read that, and I'm not trying to take up all the time.
Take all you want.
But when you read that and you think about that, it's almost like that would be a good situation for them to get into, right? And I think we're probably going to mention that a couple times as we go throughout the lesson tonight. But that doesn't seem like a bad deal at all, to be able to go and serve in the house of King Nebuchadnezzar in the palace. I don't know how much everyone knows about the Babylonian Empire, but the Babylonian Empire at this time was like the greatest empire on earth. I mean, and what were they really, really known for besides their power?
Their literature.
Literature, but they had a lot of wealth. They were a very wealthy nation. And when you're a young man and you go into a situation like this, you know, the temptation would have to be there to say, hey, this is not bad.
Yeah. And I think it's very possible that some did give into that.
Yes.
And what we get here is an example of these four.
And the point's going to be, Daniel is going to be able to remain faithful.
That's right. Yeah. So I love all that. I want to focus just on that phrase in verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. You read this in 2 Kings 24, 1 and 2. You probably talked about this. Jehoiakim was actually kind of a puppet king for Egypt, right? And so Babylon and Egypt are going to kind of compete. Mr. Colby mentioned the largeness of the empire. This is with the new Babylonian Empire. There was an old Babylonian Empire that basically was just centered around Mesopotamia. Then the Assyrians come, and you've probably seen that map. Now the new Babylonians are going to take over like 612 BC. They defeat, I think that's when they defeat Nineveh. By 606, what they're doing is they're pushing back against Egyptian spread. So Egypt was trying to control this area here. Jehoiakim was put on the throne by the Egyptians. So Babylon's coming in, and so Jehoiakim is pushing back against that. But all of this, while there might be like worldly causes going on here, God is giving Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to notice 3 places where it says God gave something. And in this case, he gave Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And I just think of the words of Jeremiah in Jeremiah 25. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not listened to my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord. And I will send Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations, and I will devote them to destruction and make them an object of horror and of hissing and everlasting waste, an everlasting waste place. Just think about that God describes Nebuchadnezzar as his servant. I don't know that Nebuchadnezzar would have acknowledged that in 606 BC, right? And yet, I think the theme of the book of Daniel is God's in control of the kingdoms. So it may look like the kingdom bearing God's name has been destroyed. It has been destroyed. But all of this is in service of God's greater purposes that Daniel is going to keep pointing to. So just saying that phrase, if you're in exile, or if you're a return from exile and you're asking questions about what's going on in world history, and you say, how in the world were the gods of Babylon stronger than the God that I thought was the one true God? I think verse 2 helps answer that. The Lord gave them. Yahweh gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This is not God being defeated by the gods of Babylon. This is God using Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon to his purposes, which is going to be a very important thing for us to remember. And so I love the description of them, not only without blemish, good appearance. They have wisdom, they have knowledge, they have understanding and learning. And so these are, as Colby Main mentioned, the elite in basically in every capacity. And so they're going to be privileged to have good status. And we're going to see how that's a blessing and a curse in some ways at the beginning. Anything else to verse 4? Yeah.
One of the things that I was thinking about as I was looking particularly at this point, like I said a while ago, that would seem to kind of in a way be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at it from the other side, if you look at it from the side of the Babylonians, what are they actually trying to accomplish through doing this? It's not trying to accomplish good.
No.
You know, they're basically trying to they're basically trying to paganize them, I guess,
Yeah.
if that's a word.
They want it good from their perspective. They want to take these guys who could have been a threat, maybe lead an uprising or something, and they're like, no, let's turn them into Babylonians through and through. And you have to guess that Daniel and the friends are young. I mean, if Daniel is going to make it till 539 BC, that's another 70 years beyond this. So he's probably pretty young at the time. Let's, if you don't mind, let's go ahead and read 5 through 7, and then that'll, we can say some things there. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. I think you see here the privilege and what Babylon's trying to accomplish out of it, what the Chaldeans are trying to accomplish out of it at the same time. The privilege, you get to have the finest food Babylon has to offer. You get to eat from the same portion that the king eats from what he drinks from. You get to have a part of that. And yet, what does he do to their names? He gives them Babylonian names. I think it's interesting. I found disputed things on the meaning of the Babylonian names, but the meaning of the Hebrew names is almost undisputed. You can look at, so Daniel, God has judged. Pretty good title for this book, by the way. And when you just think about it being called God has judged, that is what the book is about and what it will continue to be about as God judges the nations. Hananiah means Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. It's like a question saying, who is like God? And then Azariah, Yahweh has helped. If you're a Babylonian and you think that you have conquered the God of the Israelites, the God of Judah, you want to change these guys' names. All right, so whatever the names are that I think Abednego was one that meant servant of Nebo, which is one of their gods, and the other ones are connected to some of their gods' names as well. If you want to show your superiority, you just start calling Daniel Belteshazzar. You call Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because you're taking away the name that reflects their idea about God, and you're imposing Babylonian Chaldean rule on them. Now, sometimes the text will refer to them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. A lot of times, even in this chapter, it refers to them again as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel, it almost exclusively refers to as Daniel and doesn't refer to in his Babylonian name. So I'm sure that they answered to those names when they were in public service. But I don't think the scriptures want us to forget who they really were and what their names represented. But so you've got this situation, and the food that the king ate. Again, we just mentioned this. That looks like a blessing. It's going to be a challenge, as we'll notice in the next section.
Especially for someone of this age.
That's right.
And, Daniel would be a pretty young man at this time. And I think Larson was probably going to talk about this when he talked about the period, the time that he served there. But how would we know that Daniel is kind of young at this point? Why would we say that? What would give us grounds to say that? Okay. And we know that he was there for the whole 70 years, right? So at the end of the captivity, he's an old man, which kind of is going to tell us that he was pretty young when it started. So I think I've heard it said that he was probably between 14 and 20, somewhere along in there. I don't know that, but I've read something like that. My point is, a young man that age, again, the temptation would be great to say, wow, the food of the king's palace, but that's not the way these young men, not the way they conduct themselves.
That's right. That's right.
Also, if this was today, there would be Christian parents that would be tempted to say, this is a great opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, parents of all kinds, but I'm
Yeah.
and maybe not see the danger or overlook it, and it's right there.
Okay, so I think 1 through 7 forms a section. I think it forms a unit. God gave his people into the hands of the Babylonians. That includes both the wicked kings, and I think as we look at Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, at this moment, I don't know that we can draw conclusions necessarily about where they stand in all of this. Maybe we would have some good feelings toward them because of how they are already being described as wise and knowledgeable and that sort of thing. But there were kings who were wise and knowledgeable who didn't use that wisdom and knowledge in appropriate ways. And so maybe we don't know exactly how they're going to fit into all this. But then as we see in Daniel 1 verses 8 through 20, I think we're going to see, so God gave them into the hands of his enemies, but he gave them favor in the presence of his enemies. I think those are maybe our two major sections here. And even we can see that all the way through. I think the whole theme of the book of Daniel is thinking about God's people in the midst of crooked and untoward generation, in the midst of a present age that was extremely difficult. Because Daniel and his friends are going to have to suffer in the face of sins that weren't necessarily theirs individually, but because of the nation that they were a part of. So we'll note more about that as we go. Okay, what do you want to do next?
Let me take, or at least read 8 through 10 right quick.
Mm-hmm.
But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So first, going back up to verse 8, it says that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies. Now, there's been some, different ideas as to why he would not defile him. What it was that was about this food that would cause Daniel to do that. Obviously, it could have been what? Unclean. It could have been one of the foods that it talks about being unclean in the Jewish law, or it could have been I've heard talk about it, food that might have been sacrificed by idols or
Yeah.
something like that. Regardless, it doesn't matter. Daniel's faithfulness and his perseverance to do what God says in the face of this is the main point, regardless of what it was that defiled the food. Daniel knew what defiled it. Also, when you get down to verse 10, Daniel wasn't the only one that had stake in this. He wasn't the only one that had skin in the game. The chief of the eunuchs, when Daniel asked him not to make them eat it, what is his reaction? What is he afraid is going to happen to him? Yeah, he's afraid he'll be killed by the king for not doing what he was told to do. So, in a way, he's going to be used by God here as well.
That's right. Yeah, and he kind of puts Daniel on the spot at the end of verse 10. So you would endanger my head with the king. That is, if you do this, you're putting my life at risk, and maybe trying to guilt Daniel into just going along and getting along so that we don't have to worry about all this. So I love this in verse 9. So it's the same word in verse 9. The Lord gave, in verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim. Here, and God gave, granted, your translation might say, I think it talks about brought him into favor, but it's the same word, gave, Daniel, favor and compassion. And those words, your text might say something like loving kindness and compassion. That's the hesed word, covenant loyalty, covenant faithfulness. It was used in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7 to describe the very character of God. That word compassion is used throughout the Old Testament to talk about the love of a father towards a son or a mother towards a son. So you've got God in His covenant faithfulness and in His compassion for Daniel. He grants him that as he goes and he speaks to the chief of the servants, the chief of the eunuchs. And so what we see, God caring for His people in exile, which is a major theme of the book. And we'll see that through lots of the captivity and return books, is one of the major things, is that God still sees His people even when the nation might be gone. And He does, in fact, see that here. So the eunuch, the chief eunuch's question is making sure that these people are in good physical condition when they're presented before the king. He is afraid that by rejecting the king's food, whatever the reason for that rejection is, they're not going to be where they need to be physically. And so that's his main concern. So are you okay with me going to verse 11?
Yes.
So let's read verse 11 and let's go to verse 16. Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in the flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So you have Daniel saying, put us to the test. And I really think that what this demonstrates, I don't think Daniel is testing God in the sense that he's like provoking him and seeing if he's really going to keep his word. I think Daniel, in his confidence and his faith in God, is saying, I can be faithful and God's going to take care of me in that circumstance. I don't think the emphasis of this, have you seen recipes for like figuring out exactly what the health food craze for Daniel food? I don't think that's the point. And I don't know that we could rely on eating just what Daniel ate and rely and say that we're going to be physically as well off as people who have a richer, fuller diet. But Daniel could count on that because he knew the kind of time he was living in, and he could count on God that his appearance would be just what it needed to be before the king. And so you see God, I think the implication here, it doesn't say specifically that God's the one who made him fatter, but he had brought him into favor. Yeah.
And it goes back to verse 9, I think.
That's right.
God is the one that's at work here.
That's exactly right.
It wouldn't have mattered if they hadn't have ate anything.
That's right. He could have taken care of it. Yeah, that's exactly right. So what you see here, from verses 8 all the way down to verse 16, faithfulness in the middle of exile, We'll notice more about that in just a second, that they're still in exile. Let's not forget that. It seems to me that it's not as if they are unwilling to do certain things. But there comes a line, and they say, we can't cross that one. And they don't. So you've got their faithfulness in exile, and you've got God's faithfulness in exile, which is a good lesson for us as well. We're not jumping first to application to us. We want to understand the story on its own terms first. But we live in exile. And I think when I read the book of 1 Peter, I think he must have had the book of Daniel open as he was writing it, because there's so many echoes of the things that they were facing that we face as well. Okay. Anything else through verse 16? Anything you guys, questions or comments that you have all the way up to verse 16? I hadn't really paused to ask for your help on all that.
I think Daniel's success starts, and our success starts with the fact that he purposed in his heart. He was determined, I'm going to do what's right no matter what.
That's right.
And that's the only way that we're going to make it.
Exactly. I think that's a great phrase. It'd be a great sermon. He set his heart. He purposed in his heart. He resolved. He made this. What I would say is, I think what Daniel shows himself to be all through the book is somebody has said, I'm going to follow God. And I don't know that he knew all the places where those questions were going to come up, where the conflict was going to happen. I don't know that. I mean, he had been praying evidently out his window for a long time, and that had never been an issue. And then all of a sudden it was. I think the idea here is Daniel said, I know who I'm going to follow. And that's what we want to commit to. That's where our allegiance is I know what I'm going to do. I know the standard that I'm going to determine the things I do by. And then I can't tell you all the places where that's going to intersect with challenges that are brought to us. But I know that we renounce everything else and we make our commitment to Jesus. And so I think that is exactly right. Super helpful. And maybe you've heard this point. You know, when we see pictures of Daniel in the lion's den, he's normally pictured as kind of a young guy. But he's not a young guy, right? He's at least 80, right? So if you're at least 80, you're not as young a guy as you once were. But he's an old man by that point. But I would have to say that standing up to lions would take some prior preparation. And I think we see this here maybe as a late teenager. He's making that preparation, and he's setting in his heart. And that creates a character in him. And in Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they're part of this too. They're not the focal characters, but they're in this too. It sets them up to stand up against. See, in this case, they're able just to go to the guy and say, hey, just give us 10 days and let's see if this works out. It's not that way when it comes to bowing down before the idol in chapter 3. It's not that way in chapter 6 when it's up to keep praying. Like, it's going to be brought right before the king immediately. But they had already set their heart. They had faced the smaller challenges when they were late teens, so that when they're older, they're ready to face other challenges. And I don't know who was preparing them back home, but I like to think that their parents had been giving them lots of encouragements about the kind of people they were supposed to be, whether they were at home or whether they were in Babylon, Shinar, wherever they went. I think there must have been a lot of instruction about how to set their hearts.
Which wouldn't have been easy in their situation.
That's exactly right.
Either.
No, you're exactly right. Yes, I mean, you just think about the world that they were living in Judah. It was a wicked and corrupt place. Yes. So if they're able to be faithful there, then in some ways that was training ground for being faithful in Babylon. So that's very good. That's helpful. Anything else to verse 16? All right. If you want to take us to the end, or however far you want to.
As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And that's going to be important when we get to chapter 2. Now, at the end of the days when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all of his realm. So basically, verse 17 is talking about during that time that they were preparing themselves to go before the king, when they were eating the vegetables and drinking the water, and all of the other young young guys were eating the king's delicacies, that preparation was being made. And then they're starting in verse 18, they are brought before the king, and what does it look like? Who's stronger? Yes. Daniel and his friends are on the top. Why? Because it was God doing the work. Exactly. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, there was none found like them. And that included all of the smartest people that Nebuchadnezzar could have imagined bringing before him. I mean, the people that it's talking about here, the magicians and the astrologers that it talks about in 20, the way I understood it, that's supposed to be the smartest people that he could have possibly brought before him. And Daniel and his friends are well above them because of what God has done for them. And then verse 21, thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus, which would be the end of the period of captivity.
Yep. So you got that God gave phrase again in verse 17. You see that? So you've got God, the Lord gave, verse 2, God gave, verse 9, and God gave, verse 17. I think those might be good section markers for the chapter. The Lord gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. In the middle of that, he gave favor to one of the exiles. And when he gave favor to one of the exiles, that means he gave them wisdom in the face of the challenges that they were facing and enduring. I love this. One commentator wrote about verse 21 that he was there all the way till the time of Cyrus. It says, though he never outlived his love for Jerusalem, when we get to chapter 9 and we see his prayer about Jerusalem and the people there, and though he never outlived his love for Jerusalem, he never went home. And I think that's in some ways it's heartbreaking, but it's also beautiful because in chapter 10 and verse 1, it will tell us that Daniel knows that exiles got to go home. So Daniel is not one of those guys. He will live in exile his whole life. He will never experience the fulfillment personally of the promise that God made for a day to go home. But he knows God kept his word. And I think that's beautiful. I think about Hebrews 11. They never got the promises. Even the returnees from exile didn't get the full promise. But Daniel didn't see the fulfillment of all these promises. And yet he knew that God was faithful to his word. So there's lots of major themes in this chapter. And I think that will shape us through the whole book. Daniel and his friends, faithful in the middle of exile. They're self-disciplined. We see that their health and their looks and their skills don't come from the Babylonian king and his dietary regulations. They come from God, regardless of what Daniel and his people, his friends ate. God's name is going to be exalted before the world. I think we see that here in chapter 1. I wonder if the chief of the eunuchs had some questions about all of this. They definitely will in chapter 2 and 4 and 6 when Daniel and his friends continue to stand up. Well, in chapter 3 with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. One commentator said this: his witness of God bestowing gifts in exile will remain one of the book's chief interests and among its most enduring legacies. I think that's true. The idea that God can bless his people even when they're not at home, even when they're in exile, I think is one of the great things that we can draw from this book, living as sojourners and pilgrims in our own time, is that we can set our hearts in the presence of whoever, and we can trust that God will preserve us. And I love this. We don't have to assume that Daniel and his friends thought everything was going to work out physically. Remember in chapter 3 with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? But if not, we still won't bow down, right? Even if God didn't deliver them physically, they knew ultimately he would preserve them. And I think that's the confidence we can have. I think the Lord's going to take care of us. We seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and everything's going to be added to us. But even if the day comes where our faithfulness to God means we don't get food, clothing, shelter, or life protection, he still provides just what we need. And we can have that confidence like Daniel did in Babylonian captivity. Anything to finish this up?
No.
Read chapters 2 and 3, Lord willing, for Wednesday evening. That's where we'll be. And we look forward to continuing the story of Daniel and this book. Thank you very much for your participation. Good job. That was great. It didn't take us long to get in rhythm, I don't think. I thought we did pretty good.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, Please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.